Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I think we are in for a real treat. I'm Deidre Berzer. I'm the director of the South Dakota Historical Society Press, and it is our great pleasure to publish Bill Pratt's After Populism, the Agrarian Left on the Northern Plains. We actually just released this book 2 days ago, so we kind of tried to time that with his history talks for us. And our official biography of Bill that I'm borrowing from the book, I'll just read real quick. He is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. He was the Distinguished Fulbright Lecturer in American History at Moscow State University in 2000, and a Senior Fulbright Lecturer in American Studies at the University of Warsaw in 2007. Just reading Bill's book and talking with him, you get the sense of the kind of history he does, and it's like a detective, right? And I think you'll get a sense of that from what he shares with us. But he's just searching through all kinds of basements to see what kind of documents he could find. He's been on all kinds of gravel roads all over the northern Great Plains. He was telling me yesterday about there are far more gravel roads than anyone might realize across the northern Great Plains, and just finding these nuggets of history and putting them together that really, as he was saying, you know, sometimes people think you can just do all of this on the computer, on the internet, and absolutely you can't find those nuggets of things that are hiding in people's basements from the computer. So this is what Bill has done for decades, and we put together essays that were printed in different places, and he brought them all together with a thread, united them all. So I'm going to stop talking and let Bill take over. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and please welcome Bill Pratt. Oh yes, and I should ask you, make sure you're muted, and at the end there'll be time for questions, and I'll ask it that you write those out in the chat, and then I will moderate them and tell them to Bill. So thank you.
Okay.
Okay, you're on, Bill.
I'm going to start by explaining my title, After Populism, the Agrarian Left on the Northern Plains, 1900-1960. This is a study of 20th century movements and people, but the words after populism provide some political and historical context for what follows. Populism was the most important farmer political movement in American history. It took place in the late 19th century and had its greatest following on the northern and central plains and in the deep south. Populists were elected governors in the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Kansas, and senators and congressmen elected in South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. A key idea in populism was a belief that government should serve ordinary people, farmers, and workers, and underdogs, rather than the big corporations like the railroads. A key document in populist history is the Omaha Platform of 1892. And it's listed a bunch of reform proposals and the basic philosophy of the movement. One quote from the preamble: "We believe that the power of government, in other words, of the people, should be expanded as rapidly as far as the good sense of an intelligent people and the teaching of experience shall justify, to the end that oppression, injustice, and poverty shall eventually cease in the land." The populists promoted and had an effort to introduce some of these reforms, such as the direct election of the president, direct election of U.S. senators, the secret ballot, the initiative and referendum, and government farm programs. South Dakota, incidentally, was the first state to enact the initiative and referendum. The historic role of third parties often has been to play the role of educator and promoter. They introduce an idea that gets more popular, and the old parties take it over and put it in their program. Populism as an independent political movement ran out of steam by the end of the 19th century. But some of the lessons learned then continued, as did some of the popular lore. In Kansas, there was a woman populist by the name of Mary Elizabeth Lease. And she supposedly said that farmers should raise less corn and more hell. That slogan was repeated for decades after, and even in the 1980s, you could get a good hand when you introduced them. One of the lessons that some people learned from the populist experience was that third parties don't work in the United States. But not everybody in the countryside learned that lesson in the 20th century. Many historians reserve the terms populist and populism to that 19th century movement. And I'm one of those historians. We often think its terms are overused, misused, and misunderstood when they're applied to politicians and movements in the 20th century, and that's especially the case in the last 40 years. The terms left and the left often are overused as well. The term left, as many historians are going to use it, is not something synonymous or identical with the word liberalism. Historically, many on the left were quite critical of mainstream liberalism. Socialists and communists obviously were clearly on the left, but those are terms that are applied ideologically. And there were many more people that we can place on the left who didn't think of themselves as socialists. The much bigger category of people, they were critical of the society and the existing economic ways, but they weren't trying to replace the entire economic system. Perhaps they would be found in movements such as the farmer labor movement in Minnesota or the Nonpartisan League in North Dakota, and in organizations, economic organizations such as the Farmers Union. Many, probably most people on the left historically worked or coexisted in broader-based groups alongside of others who did not seek to make as big changes as they did. And that was true both in political and economic organizations. The focus of my book is largely in the Dakotas, but often looks at developments in neighboring states as Minnesota, Montana, and Nebraska. Sometimes, in the case of the Nonpartisan League, which started in North Dakota, it was a movement that spilled over into neighboring states. The Minnesota Farmer Labor Party, which was strong in the 20s and 1930s, owes a good bit of a debt to the Nonpartisan League, but it wasn't really the Nonpartisan League made over. Oftentimes, the Dakota developments were versions or spin-offs of regional or national trends. In 1924, Robert La Follette, Republican senator from the state of Wisconsin, ran an independent campaign for presidency. His best showing outside of his home state of Wisconsin was on the Northern Plains, where he finished second from North Dakota, Minnesota, Montana, and South Dakota. The Farmers Union is a strong farm organization in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana, and at times in Iowa and Nebraska. I think it's important to make a distinction between political and economic movements. Political movement seeks political power through a political organization, whether it is actually a political party, a third party like the People's Party, or a political grouping or faction like the Nonpartisan League, which sought to work within the existing two-party system. Economic movements like the Grange or the Farmers Alliance or the Farmers Union focus on economic issues more like a trade union than a political party. You'd support building a cooperative, buying gas at a cooperative gas station. It doesn't matter whether you're a socialist or a communist or a right-wing Republican. Now, if you're interested in using the services of a co-op, it doesn't matter what your politics are. State lines and state boundaries are important for both political and economic movements. The Nonpartisan League was more successful in North Dakota than anywhere else. It established the Bank of North Dakota, and to this day, it's the only state-owned, operated bank in the United States. Now, people in the Nonpartisan League made a strong effort to establish it in other places. They had some real success in organizing in western Minnesota, northeastern South Dakota, northeastern Montana, and other places. But one of the differences between the Nonpartisan League experience in North Dakota, where it first started, and other states, is that the opposition knew that the Nonpartisan League was on the way. And then World War I broke out, and following that was an anti-radical hysteria, which proved very difficult for organizations like the Nonpartisan League to take root. State lines are also important when we're talking about economic movements. Farmers Union had its greatest success in North Dakota. It had more difficulty in Minnesota. In South Dakota, it was reasonably successful, but probably, again, North Dakota had the strongest organization. In Montana, there was a more left-leaning organization in the 40s and 50s, but it wasn't as large or as powerful as in North Dakota. Overall, there probably was more room for the left in the North Dakota Farmers Union and the Montana Farmers Union in the 30s than anywhere else. The 1930s, very interesting era for students of American history. Farm revolt across the region and elsewhere in the United States was quite prevalent, but the upper Midwest and Northern Plains were the center of that insurgency. This was the worst economic crisis in American history. Farm prices dropped, and many farmers feared they would lose their farms. In 1932, Farmers' Holiday Movement was organized, often sponsored by the Farmers Union. This is particularly the case in North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, not Nebraska. There was a lot of militancy here and not a lot of direction in many places. A farm strike was declared. Now, what a farm strike amounted to was a withholding action. It wasn't that farmers were going to stop farming, but they were supposed to stop taking their goods, their products to market. As a practical matter, there was picketing around many market centers, and sometimes there were barricades put on the roads, and sometimes violence broke out in the wake of that. Farm protest was a front-page national story in the late summer and fall of 1932. This is a very decentralized movement. There were marches on state capitals, marches on Pier, marches on St. Paul, marches on Lincoln, marches on Bismarck. To lobby legislators for a particular piece of legislation, a moratorium on foreclosures. Well, there were other activities too that involved some of the farmers' holiday. And one of these was an effort to stop farm sales. These efforts sometimes were referred to as penny auctions or Sears and Roebuck sales. And I want to illustrate one particular one in Nebraska. This occurred in October of 1932. A widow was faced with foreclosure that was going to take all her livestock and farm equipment. She had a loan with a bank that she couldn't pay. Hundreds of farmers showed up as planned to interfere with that sale. Essentially, they wouldn't allow anybody to bid but a representative of a bidding committee. And if someone tried to make a second bid, they were persuaded by people in the crowd not to. And so a cow or a hog might be auctioned off for 5 cents. All her livestock and chattels were auctioned off for a grand total of $5.35. That settled her debt. Now, if you had loaned money, you were a bank or insurance company, and you knew something like this might happen, you might decide you'll wait a while and give that farmer a chance to have a better crop, better income, and pay off the debt. Now, it didn't always work, but it was repeated, or efforts were repeated throughout the region countless times, 1932, 1933. Western Nebraska, there were 2 women who were quite involved in this effort to stop sales. One of them, Edith Pearson. She was 40 years old. She emerged as a leader. I was just reading a headline here from the Lincoln Star, woman leader of farm group. And then a few weeks later from the Omaha World Herald, woman leader for farmers. She was a good speaker, and she essentially took over the local holiday organization out there momentarily. There was another example of women involved in stopping farm sales in Madison, Minnesota, which is western Minnesota. The men went off to St. Paul to lobby the legislature, and their wives and daughters were left home, and they turned out and stopped the sale in Madison. That particular episode got a lot of publicity. Oftentimes it was just a little story, but it appeared in numerous newspapers. Well, the farmers' holiday movement was extremely decentralized. And I want to mention a little bit about left-wing efforts before the farmers' holidays started. In 1930, communists organized the United Farmers League. The United Farmers League, always a small group, actually stopped some sales in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in 1931, in northeastern Montana, and pockets in the Dakotas. And after the holiday got underway, you had 2 organizations out there. One of them was much bigger and harder to find in terms of membership and participation, the Farmers' Holiday. And eventually, communists got involved in the Farmers' Holiday in many locales as well. People who didn't like farm protests generally often wanted to call the Farmers' Holiday a communist organization, which it clearly was not. But communists did participate in some locales. This is a very decentralized effort, and you can't always tell who the players are. There's a famous photograph on the state capitol, Lincoln, Nebraska. Big picture, full of people with placards and so forth. And if you look carefully at the photograph, you'll see contradictory signs. There's clearly an anti-Semitic sign there. Another sign, however, reads, "Workers of the World Unite." And another one says, "Free Tom Mooney," which was a left-wing cause celeb. They all take roles when they have a rally, and it's often difficult to determine who's involved. That particular photograph, which is often reprinted, was cropped. The actual photograph that was made was a photograph that was bigger, involved more people. I only ever saw a newspaper copy of the original photograph, but it's about a third bigger than the one that's often portrayed in the books. The overwhelming number of people who participated in this kind of protest in the countryside clearly were not communist or socialist or people leaning that way. There was some right-wing participation, some real right-wing participation, and some anti-Semitism. Communist numbers depended on the locale. In some places like Roberts County, South Dakota, the extreme northeast corner of the state, had a strong communist presence, and the United Farmers League was organized there, I think, in the late 1932, early 1933. Here is a comment penned by a teacher in Roberts County, late 1933. He wrote it to Earl Browder, who was head of the American Communist Party. We believe that if the cities were organized as strongly as we are right in my school district, the revolution would be pulled off without delay. We thought the revolution would start sure this winter, but it seems to recede into the dim future. I might add that although the communist numbers declined in Roberts County, there were 3 or 4 party units that continued into the 1940s. There were other pockets of left-wing sentiment in the region, and sometimes they were in places that had a left-wing past. Burke County, North Dakota, which borders Canada in the northwestern part of North Dakota. That was the only county in the Dakotas that was carried by the socialist presidential candidate, Eugene Debs, in 1912. That was a place that also had some farm protests in the early 1930s. Bergen, North Dakota, a small village maybe 25 miles east of Minot. In the pre-World War I era, had 63 Socialist Party members. In the local cemetery, there are 2 tombstones dated 1914 era, 1913. 2 tombstones that have the slogan, "Workers of the World Unite." One time, I was up in northeastern South Dakota. I spent a week in Roberts County. It was in the fall and the weather was wonderful. I had heard about a farm organizer named Oscar Brecky. He was from Grant County, which adjoins Roberts County to the south. And he had been quite active in the holiday. He had been president of the Grant County holiday and later president of the South Dakota holiday. Well, nobody knew where he was. They knew the name, but they didn't know where he was. I went to Millbank, which is the county seat of Grant County, and I went to the local newspaper office, and I asked him, man, if he knew about Oscar Brecky. He said, I think he gets the paper. So he looked up in his files. In those days, you didn't look up on the computer. It was a little 3x5 card. Oscar Brecky was in a nursing home over in nearby in western Minnesota. So I went over. I missed it the first time. I had to turn around. Eventually, I did find the town and found the nursing home. I went in and asked about him. They said, he's probably down watching the film. So I walked down to a recreation room, and I saw in the middle of the room, it looked like everybody was in a wheelchair. Went over, I talked to a staff person. I said, I'd like to talk to Oscar Brecky this year. She went over, and I heard something like, who is it? And she must have said, he's standing over there and waiting. Let him stand there and wait. She motioned me over. I walked over there. I introduced myself. I said I wanted to talk to him about the farmer's holiday. He said, "That was a long time ago. I'll talk about that. Wheel me back to my room." Gave me a little idea about some of the people who emerged in the leadership of farm protest in the 1930s. I had a fascinating visit with him. Another time I went out to Western Nebraska. I had written letters to 3 local newspapers, 2 in Western Nebraska and 1 in Eastern Colorado. I got a telephone call in my office at the university. The man said, "If you're coming out here, why don't you stop and talk to me?" Which I did do, and he drove me around after I went out there on my spring break. He introduced me to the sheriff of Sedgwick County, which is in Colorado. He had a broken leg, but that sheriff drove me around and opened up the county museum so I could read some of the back issues of the newspaper. When I was leaving, I often go to cemeteries, and I was looking at a cemetery in Lodgepole, Nebraska, and I took a picture of a tombstone. Later, I showed the picture to my wife, and she said, "What's that over in the corner?" We looked at the photograph more carefully. It looked like a snake. It looked like a rattlesnake. My wife made some comment about how you need to be careful and so forth. I assured her if I knew there was a snake there, she would have never seen that photograph. New Deal farm programs were introduced in 1933, and they played a big role in undercutting farm protests, no doubt about it. 1933 in fall, a second farm strike was called, and it pretty much was a flop. Person representing doing fact-finding for the Roosevelt administration turned up in Omaha at the National Farmers Union Convention. She wrote back, "Apparently one thing that is contributing largely to its failure," that's the failure of that strike, "contributing largely to its failure is the arrival of wheat allotment checks. I believe our CWA program will also do a lot to calm them down. Quite a few farmers will be getting jobs out of it. It will give them something to do and a little money." Well, farm programs certainly did undercut the protest, and in some ways, a number of people were helped. But it wasn't immediate help, and it didn't happen everywhere. I mentioned Roberts County earlier. Well, it was having penny auctions well after the farm programs were introduced. Probably the protest peaked in 1934. And there are reports in other parts of the region of farm penny auctions as late as 1936 or so. And the United Farmers League, that had been organized by communists, was phased out. Members were urged to join the holiday or the farmers union. And after a while, the holiday folded up shop, urging its members to join the farmers union. Farmers union got pro-New Deal leadership. And after it took over and assumed a left liberal posture, a significant number of left-leaning farmers were in its ranks well into the 1940s. After World War II and the emergence of Cold War tensions, and then McCarthyism, which was an extreme anti-communist reaction, not only against radicals and left-wingers, but against liberalism itself. And then the Korean War. Well, but with the Korean War breaking out, dissenters in the farm movement were put on alert. Iowa's Farmers Union President Fred Stover, who was very critical of U.S. foreign policy, he opposed U.S. involvement in the Korean War, and he and his organization were purged from the Farmers Union Farmers Union became more domesticated with the Cold War tensions, more cautious and increasingly comfortable moving towards the political center. There was no place anymore for left liberal organizations in agriculture. Might be a few fringe groups out there, like Fred Stover's U.S. Farmers Association. But when the anti-war movement emerged in the 1960s, there was little obvious support from organized agriculture. I might add, as an epilogue to my remarks, in the 1980s, we saw a resurgence of farm protests. The 1980s witnessed the worst farm crisis since the 1930s, and there were not nearly as many farmers left. Maybe 3% of the overall population was on the farm by the 1980s. But these were really hard times for farmers who were in debt. High interest rates and low prices. Farmers who had a debt were in a very precarious position. In response to that, there were new organizations that cropped up. The New York Times in the mid-80s reported that there were something like 100 to 150 new groups, many of them quite small, that were cropping up to help people in the countryside. And most of them, according to this story, identified with populism. You might recall that slogan that Mary Elizabeth Lease allegedly said, "Farmers should raise less corn and more hay." I sometimes would quote that before groups, and it always got a good response. But despite this emotional identification with populism as a practical matter, this new generation of protesters found tactics identified more with the farm revolt of the 1930s than anything that happened in the 1890s. And one of the things that did appeal was that penny auction where they tried to stop sales. And we had penny auctions or efforts to stop farm sales, or at least get them postponed. One of the groups that emerged in the 1980s was the North American Farm Alliance. And this was an effort to try and bring together these smaller groups into an organization that would be able to have more success in politics and elsewhere. When I say more success in politics, I mean lobbying rather than forming a new political party or anything like that. And one of the key leaders of the North American Farm Alliance was Merle Hansen. He was from Newman Grove, Nebraska, which was a center of farmer holiday activity in the 1930s. And they were the ones behind stopping that farm that I talked, that farm sale with the widow Bonbon. Hansen also was a veteran of left-wing farm work. He had been involved with the U.S. Farmers Association for a long time earlier. Different tactics were used this time around. This newer generation of farm protest people, in addition to trying to learn from the past and using history to make history, they're a lot more savvy about media and publicity. And they also had some people who were interested and very capable of getting involved with legal action and counseling. Sarah Vogel, who just came out with a book called The Farmer's Lawyer, was a key player in legal action against the Farmers' Home Administration. You might mention there's quite an irony here. The Farmers' Home Administration grew out of the Farm Security Administration, which was a New Deal agency. And among its responsibilities was to be the last lender of resort. Farmer couldn't get a loan somewhere else. He might be able to get it from the Farm Security Administration. In the 1940s, that organization was changed to the Farmers Home Administration, much more an agency that loaned money to farmers. Well, in the 1980s, the Farmers Home Administration often was foreclosing on farmers to get those loans back. You know, they were set up to be a lender of last resort. Well, the last resort often was a foreclosure notice from Farmers Home. And Sarah Vogel and some others conducted lawsuits against the Farmers Home. And they got an injunction issued against Farmers Home, which required Farmers Home to actually follow its regulations. And then we had farm legislation, which, among other things, actually incorporated some of the things from that injunction order. Carol Hodgman was a young woman who was raised in Iowa farm, was involved in the women's movement, and she also took a leadership role in the North American Farm Alliance. One of the things that happened in the 1980s was an effort on the part of the far right in this country and anti-Semites to really work hard in the Farm Belt to get recruits. And one of the groups that was formed in the 1980s was called Prairie Fire. Now, Prairie Fire did a lot of counseling, a lot of things. They worked hard to educate people to counteract anti-Semitism in the farm. Farm movement of the 1980s got some good allies. One was Jesse Jackson, who could really turn out a crowd, and Willie Nelson, who created Farm Aid, which helped support some of these small groups that were organized. There's no question that in the 1980s, there were some things that did help people in distress. And the requirements of due process for borrowers and the requirement that government agency had to follow their own rules were very beneficial. What happens with protest, whether we're talking about it in the 1930s or the 1980s, is you get something very public, which can get publicity. It also brings pressure on government agencies. And perhaps most importantly, at least some of the time, protest buys time. It buys time for weather conditions to change. It buys time for political currents to change. It creates the possibility of some opportunities to help resolve problems. There were some victories in the 1980s, but these efforts actually proved to be the final chapter of left-to-center rural insurgency in American history. Okay. I'm finished.
Okay. So I've stopped the screen share so we can do some questions because I discovered I don't know how to see chat questions while screen share is on. So I'm going to relay questions to Bill, and if you have more, please type them in. And we've got some good ones already lined up here, Bill. Okay. Could you address the more recent uses and misuses of the term populism and how I assume Richard Hofstadter's ideas seem to rise up again and again like zombies? Thank you for that, Stephen. And tell me if you need me to repeat that because it's got two parts.
That's fine. I like that notion of they come about like zombies, keep reappearing. I think one has to make a distinction between programs and style. And in more recent times, that word populist or populism is applied to virtually anybody who is reacting or sounding like they are a disadvantaged group. They don't have any reference to the idea that the government can actually serve people. A lot of the people that are called populists seem to be opposed to government. Well, they might better be called anarchists in that sense. I don't want to take that too far. But one of the things that has happened is it's become a convenient label to use for people that are outspoken and aren't clearly in a position of authority. And so some of the people that are espousing views today that are called populist or populistic would be totally anathema to the populists of the 19th century. They wanted to use government. They thought the problem was that government was serving big business, big corporations, the railroads and so forth. They wanted to serve the people. But the idea of Hofstadter, I have wrestled with, argued with, contradicted Richard Hofstadter's chapter in The Age of Reform since I read it for the first time in the 1960s. I'm not proud of what I'm about to tell you, because Richard Hofstadter actually was a great historian, even if The Age of Reform wasn't a great book. But in 1970, he was nominated to be vice president of the Organization of American Historians, which is the trade association for American historians. I was at the national meeting. I voted against him and voted for a graduate student who had been nominated. Richard Hofstadter died the next year. Well, he was like 54 years old when he died. His view of populism was not based on real thorough research. You could say that. He said they may be the source of contemporary anti-Semitism and so forth. I don't want to rule out that there was anti-Semitism in the countryside back in the 1890s or the 1980s. There was. And even the South Dakota populist newspaper, official newspaper, had an editorial which I think was anti-Semitic. I pointed it out twice in print, and nobody else ever seemed to pick up on it. But it's sort of like a dirty secret that people don't want to talk about anymore. But the suggestion that that political movement of the late 19th century was the source of most anti-Semitism in the country is beyond the pale. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in the United States. And some of it was in Ivy League colleges where they had quota systems against Jews. There were anti-Semitic riots in some cities. I never saw any evidence of that in the populist era in the countryside. But rhetorical anti-Semitism, yeah, it was in. Just like it is today.
Thanks for that, Bill. That was very enlightening. Okay, next question from Kyle. What effect did these agrarian left activists have on the political beliefs and actions of George Mcgovern, Hubert Humphrey, and Karl Mundt? Some of our Northern Plains politicians of the mid-20th century.
That would be a nice lunch group, wouldn't it? Well, these are three successful politicians. And they all had a good relationship with the farmers' union. Karl Mundt often voted for measures that the farmers' union wanted in Congress. he was very anti-labor, very organized labor, whereas Humphrey and Mcgovern were quite pro-organized labor. I suspect in both the cases of Mcgovern and Hubert Humphrey, there might have been some influence early in their political thinking. By the time they were actually getting elected to office, there's hardly anybody out there who's running for office for a major party that's going to be willing to say they're a left wing. I think Mundt might not have been upset if someone called him a right wing, but I don't think once they get to the Congress or U.S. Senate, I think they're going to be quite careful how they phrase things. Emil Lorix ran against Karl Mundt for Congress in 1938. And Lorix came out of the farmers' union, leader of the holiday in South Dakota and so forth. That was a very spirited campaign. There was a lot of bitterness in that 1938 congressional campaign. Later, Mundt and Lorix acted as though they were friends, and they talked that way. I don't think they were real close or anything, but there were times when they agreed on legislation. John Miller has a wonderful article entitled something like McCarthyism Before McCarthy. It's an article in that 1938 congressional campaign in South Dakota. That is one of the best articles I've read in American political history. It appeared in a very obscure place, but it's quite a good article. John Miller, incidentally, may have been the best historian of South Dakota, the state.
Yes, we definitely, we miss his presence in South Dakota history, that is for sure. Richard Johnson wanted us to note that you may have left out Georgia in your list of states that elected populist congressmen at the time. So just a little note there, and it looks like I got another
Tom Watson
question here.
Person I think he's alluding to. Tom Watson, a wonderful biography of Tom Watson I see here in Liberty. Sort of a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde character. That in some ways he seemed to be very much a reformer, and then he ended up his career quite embittered, and actually managed to get elected to the U.S. Senate at the very end of his life.
Right, and then Michael Card, who's one of our recent authors, has a note about South Dakota's authorization and implementation of several experiments with government ownership. And Michael says sometimes badly and sometimes well, right? Hail insurance, loaning money to farmers, called Rural Credit Program, which was now called Pheasant Industry, so prison woodworking, 2 coal mines, selling gasoline from county highway shops, all those good things. But direct involvement in banking, such as the Bank of North Dakota, did not happen in South Dakota. And so Michael's wondering, was the banking industry so powerful in South Dakota that it prevented what has turned out to save the state great money, provide lower cost loans to North Dakota students at North Dakota institutions and so forth? So that's a really interesting question.
I recall efforts to get a Bank of South Dakota, but I guess you also have to look at what the political dynamics were at the time. The nonpartisan league actually started had to run like a third party because of the primary laws and so forth in the state. They never had the support to get enough people in the legislature to implement something like the Bank of South Dakota. That when you compare North Dakota and South Dakota in terms of the nonpartisan league, Roberts County, Hutchinson County, a couple of other places at times had its strong nonpartisan league, which was for Farmer Labor Party, which it became in 1923, but they just didn't have the political clout to get enough people in the legislature. Now, one of the things that might comment on, and this has to do with other farm movements and their abilities, they often had ideas that had a lot of appeal. One of the problems that populists had, and sometimes the nonpartisan league had when they actually got political power, was executing these measures. And the North Dakota Farmers Union, North Dakota nonpartisan league, in some ways, it's a story of tragedy, because they tried to do too much that they couldn't do very well. It was a wonderful political machine in terms of getting voters and arousing the public. But after they were in power a couple of terms, they tried to do too many things. And it wasn't so much the people who were in public office as it was some of the people who were managing the nonpartisan league, like A.C. Towling and some of the people around him. Towling himself never held the public office, but they decided to have essentially nonpartisan league stores. They didn't call them that, but they're going to have stores. They're going to compete with the co-op movement. Well, that helps undercut their political base. There were a number of things that could have been executed better, but the nonpartisan league in North Dakota created some of their own serious problems. And if you don't control the legislature, you're not going to get a chance to implement your programs, and that often was the case in the United States.
Thank you for that. There aren't any other questions here, but I would love for you to talk about some of the research you did, especially in the archives in Moscow. I asked Bill yesterday if he was fluent in Russian, and he said no. So.
Oh, that's very true. Vernon Peterson, who's from Montana, but he actually works in the Emirates now. He came to Omaha for the Missouri Valley History Conference and made a presentation, and I got to talking with him. And he had been to Moscow with a couple other researchers. And we talked and talked and talked. I drove him to his motel, and we sat in the car for a long time talking about it. And we agreed that when he went the next time, I'd go with him. We would work out something together. And so in 1995, excuse me, Vernon Peterson and John Haynes, who had been there earlier too, we shared an apartment for a couple of weeks. And just a wonderful experience working in the archives. When you work in the archives, you actually get to see, letters that were written by people in the 1920s or 1930s. Now, this isn't microfilm. This is the actual thing. You hold it and look at it and whatever. I loved that experience. Vern and I went back 2 years later for 2 weeks. And then in 2000, I had a Fulbright. I was there 5 months. And I lectured 1 day a week and worked the archives 1 day a week. And then when my lectureship ended, I was there another several weeks. And so I could go 4 days a week. And working in the archives was great. Now, it's not like working in archives here. First place, there was no air conditioning. It can get hot in Moscow. It can get cold in Moscow. And in the same month, in May, first time I was there, it got really hot. So I thought the next time I went in May, I'd just wear a sport coat for airplane. Got there, it was bitterly cold. And the person who served as a translator and facilitator She said, "You're about the same size as my father." She loaned me a coat, and that kind of saved my life. No. But I went back, worked in the Moscow archives 5 times. 4 times just on research trips, and 1 time in Fulbright, and I was there 5 months. It is an interesting experience, and the archival cultures, every archive has a different culture. And I love to work in archives, but I really enjoyed that experience. Now, you go for 2 weeks, you think, oh, that's 10 days. No, the 3rd Thursday of the month, they close for cleaning or something, so you don't get there. But one day in 2000, I was walking down the archive. There was snow on the sidewalk, and a guy in front of me picks up a wallet, and it's full of $50 bills. He's so excited about it. And what to do? But 3 minutes later, somebody comes by and is asking something. I don't speak Russian. He asks in English, "Did you see a wallet anywhere?" Yeah, And there's this guy, "No, not me." And I kept pointing at him. And finally, he went over and he got his money back. But I mean, it was just one of those days where, in a way, you wish you hadn't seen it. But secondly, you couldn't keep it to yourself that guy had the guy's wallet full of $50 bills. But I found a lot of material in the records that related to Finns in the United States. And after a while, I started making a note here and there. And some years later, I realized I have quite a few references to that. I'm going to start researching that. And so I've started researching Finnish Americans based on materials I found in those archives. And so there's stuff there written by some people out of Brown County, South Dakota, from the Frederick area. And there's stuff from people in the National Party leadership about Finns. And so, research it has some real distractions. You find something and, oh, that's interesting, I'll look at that. It's like when you're researching a newspaper, and all of a sudden you find another story and that pulls you in that direction. But I wanted to make a comment about local newspapers. I think local newspapers are often weeklies from the teens, the 20s, the 30s, sometimes into the 40s. They are wonderful sources. And sometimes there's like community reporters, and there'll be a person every week or every other week that'll report on what happened the last week or so. Who died, this or that, whatever, somebody's in town, whatever. Well, a lot of times it didn't seem terribly interesting. But North Dakota newspaper talks about, Mr. So-and-so went to the Communist Party National Convention. His wife visited her sister somewhere else. Well, a lot of times you pass over those neighborhood or community columns, but they can actually be a rich source, and not just for talking about communists and that sort of thing. One of the experiences I had, or often had, was going to cemeteries in small towns, villages, whatever. I've walked, I don't know how many miles in cemeteries, and sometimes it's pretty hot. The reason I'm walking in those cemeteries is to find tombstones that have dates of when people died. That makes it possible, perhaps, to go look up an obituary. Or, for a lot of research I did in the 80s and the 90s, in FBI files, one of the things about FBI records in that era, if you could prove someone was dead, you could get to see their file if they had a file. Well, what better way to prove someone's dead is to show a picture of that tombstone? I mean, it'd be nice to have a death certificate, but that's a much more involved process. So I would walk cemeteries in Roberts County and Brown County, different parts of the Northern Plains, and take pictures of tombstones. And I have quite a collection of tombstone photographs. One thing that I really was very concerned about on occasion would be a wandering dog in the cemetery, or in a farmland for that matter. It's not man's best friend if that dog doesn't know you. I was up in North Dakota and I pulled in a farmstead. I wanted to find out where the finished cemetery was. I looked and there was a trailer, I think, and there was a doghouse by the trailer. I thought, oh, the dog's just standing there. I guess he's on a chain. So I start walking down towards the trailer. That dog starts running towards me. He wasn't on a chain. I run back to my car and I'm thinking, am I going to have to stand up on top of the car and that dog will keep me there all night? I jumped in the window. I was more agile then than I am now at 80. I jumped in the car window and I was able to get that window closed before the dog got. Man's best friend is not a dog up there. But man's best friend actually, when you're going around these places, is a country church privy. That, you don't have, this isn't like the interstate with rest stops and so forth. You're out, I won't say in the middle of nowhere, but you're next to nowhere. And often there's just no amenities. So when you take one of these trips, you want to make sure you know where you're going to spend the night. And you also want to make sure it's a place where you're going to be able to get something to eat. And so I often traveled with a cooler with drinks in it and a package of crackers or something, because you can go a long time without finding a place to stay. One time I was driving to North Dakota and I wasn't watching the gas gauge, or I wasn't paying enough attention. And I got up Route 29 and I passed through Sisseton. I didn't pay much attention to the gas gauge, and until I get into North Dakota, not paying much attention. After a while, I'm running out of gas and there's no place to find a gas station. I finally pulled off the road and there was a farm there where I noticed the farmer had some gas pumps, or a gas pump. It was on a Sunday, and I asked him if I could buy some gas for me. I think I got $2 worth. I am a lot more careful about gas gauges than I used to be, because there's hardly any place between the North Dakota border and Fargo to get gas. You have to get off the highway.
I'm sure you have so many stories. We've reached the end of our hour, Bill, and thank you so much for sharing your research and your thoughts over all of the various decades you've done all this analyzing, and we are the beneficiaries of that with the book that you have written. And I have a screen that has all the information on it, but I'm afraid I'm going to lose everybody if I put it up, but I will try. After Populism, it's probably backwards. You all saw it on the screen. That is available from the South Dakota Historical Society Press directly, and also through the South Dakota Historical Society Foundation Heritage Store, which is on their website, sdhsf.org, and also in person in Pierre at the Capitol and at the Cultural Heritage Center. And I'm going to try, I will try to do this. So sharing screen, I'm trying. We'll see what happens. There we go. And let me get to the next page. Okay, and then let me get to the next screen. And here you can see how to order after populism. Also, if you are not a member of the South Dakota State Historical Society, we encourage you to take a look at that. We'd love for you to join us as a member and help support programs like these. And that's information's at history.sd.gov, which is the website of the Historical Society. And I would encourage you all to join us for our September history talks. We have another one of our new fall releases from the South Dakota Historical Society Press, which is called Dancing with Welk by Christopher Vondracek. And we're hoping that's a title that will pique your interest and you'll come back to find out more about it. After Populism is a great read, and you can find out more about all of the tantalizing little stories that Bill has been telling us all evening long. They go much more in depth in the book. So please help me thank Bill for his time tonight and for sharing all of his wisdom with us. And I thank you all for joining us. Have a great evening.